I'll start with not a positive subject, but the approval rating of Congress, historically low, pretty abysmal, single digits. How are you part of the solution to improving that and not part of the problem that created that number?
Well, when we wrapped up votes before we came back to Iowa, I had a lot of Republican friends come up and wish me good luck. And I take a lot of time in my job in the House developing relationships with the people I work with, because you still have to have those relationships to get anything done. And if we're going to solve the problem of partisan gridlock, we don't need more people who are going to be part of the problem and not part of the solution. So from the very first bill that I introduced, the New Era Act, which was a job training bill for jobs in biofuels through community colleges, I worked with a Republican from Alabama named Joe Bonner to get that in the Farm Bill. He had a similar need in his district, which had lost a lot of jobs overseas in the pulp and fiber industry, and he was very interested in advancing cellulosic ethanol. Joe was on the Ag Committee, I wasn't. He worked with us to get that bill in the first Farm Bill that I voted on, so community colleges in Iowa used that program to train people for careers in biofuels. And we all know that that's been a huge part of our state's economy. But you can just go right down the list. When the Iowa National Guard came home from Iraq, they were denied GI Bill benefits and hardship pay by the Pentagon. And that was wrong, and I worked with Republicans in Minnesota who were part of that decision and were denied those same benefits. To take on the Pentagon, we introduced legislation. I had personal meetings with high-level people at the Pentagon, calling them out on this bad decision. And we got those orders changed, and they got the benefits that they deserved. I worked with a Republican from Georgia because an Iowa manufacturer reached out to me. They were going to lose jobs and stop manufacturing deli refrigerators because of a change in energy efficiency requirements for refrigeration units. They asked me to work and bring Democrats to the table. I worked with this Republican from Georgia. We got a solution passed in the House, passed in the Senate. The President signed it into law, and that Iowa company is still making these refrigeration systems in the United States. But what's important about that story is the person I worked with came to Iowa to recruit my opponent in 2010. If I let politics get in the way of doing my job for Iowans, it wouldn't have been something I would have worked on. But it was important to the people in Iowa that those jobs stay here and we keep building things in America, so I was proud to do it. The Andrew Connally Veterans Housing Act is one of the things I'm most proud of. Andrew Connally had served in Iraq, came home, married his high school sweetheart, and was diagnosed with a rare form of cancer that was paralyzing him from the chest down. He applied for a VA adaptability grant and got turned down. He reached out to me. My staff got working on it. He ended up getting a $65,000 adaptability grant for his home. And the great people in Dubuque turned that $65,000 into a brand new home through donated time, material, and appliances. He had a profoundly disabled son on a ventilator. He was so impressive in terms of wanting to help other people that I introduced the Andrew Connally Veterans Housing Act because the program he got benefits from was set to expire. And we not only extended it for 10 years, but we improved the benefits. Many new or younger veterans who come home from war spend time in their parents' home before they figure out what they're going to do with the rest of their lives. And the Andrew Connally Veterans Housing Act gives them more opportunities to adapt their parents' home while they're making that transition. He came out and testified in front of the VA hearing. And by the time he was done telling his story, there were a lot of people in that room with tears in their eyes. I was serving in the minority when he came out and testified. And because of my working relationship with the chairman of the VA committee, that bill was included in a package of veterans bills that went to the floor. It got signed into law, and disabled veterans are taking advantage of that improved benefit right now. and Andrew Connolly died about a year before the president signed that bill into law. So his wish was that we would continue to pay it forward for people like him and make sure they were taken care of.
Since you mentioned veterans, I'll move a question up here as a follow-up, and that's the criticism you've gotten for missing 75% of the Veterans Affairs Committee meetings in that 2-year period, 2011 to 2012, I believe. What do you say to those critics?
It's typical.
Say you're not a veterans person. If you were, you would have been at more of these committee meetings.
It's typical partisan politics. And anybody who wants to understand my level of commitment to working for veterans needs to go to my website and go to the Braley Truth Team, where it lays out my 8 years of hard work every day fighting for veterans. They also need to learn the truth about these ads. The ad that has gotten the most attention falsely claims I attended 3 fundraisers and that's why I missed an important VA hearing. So let me show you what I was doing on the date that's referred to in that ad. This is the date, September 20th of 2012. This is me at the World War II Memorial greeting an honor flight from eastern Iowa. This is a Korean War veteran from Burlington in this photograph. This is me with the chair of the VA subcommittee at a VA hearing that day that lasted almost 2 hours on the Transition Assistance Program, which helps veterans on active duty who are transitioning to civilian life learn about what they need to know in order to be successful. This is right outside the VA hearing room on that same day. This gentleman right here was the top employee on the Republican side of the VA subcommittee that was holding that hearing. His name is Mike Brink. His dad is from Fort Madison, Iowa, and was a Democratic state legislator. I later went to a classified briefing that day on an important national security interest that involved not only veterans but people who service in harm's way overseas. So that's the truth of how I spent my day on the day that I'm being criticized. So you want to go back and look at my full record, because I'll tell you what's not included. What's not included in there was a field hearing that I did in Waterloo, Iowa, to try to find work for unemployed veterans. It doesn't include a field hearing that I attended in Fort Wayne, Indiana, to help find ways of putting unemployed veterans back to work. It doesn't include a host of hearings that I attended that are deliberately left out because they want to mislead Iowa voters about my commitment to Iowa veterans.
But is the percentage of meetings you missed correct, or is that factually not correct? 75% in a 2-year period.
Well, if you only talk about full committee hearings and you don't talk about the subcommittee hearings that I was involved in, if you don't talk about the field hearings that I was involved in, and if you ignore all the body of work I was doing for veterans other than attending hearings, you can get a misleading figure. The reality is I've helped over 400 Iowa veterans with disability claims. And this is very personal to me. My father enlisted in the Marine Corps when he was 17. He landed on Iwo Jima the day that they raised the flags on Mount Suribachi. He brought home the invisible wounds of that war and carried them with him until he died in 1981. And the reason why veterans issues have been such an important priority for me is to honor my father's memory. And that's why it's important that people learn the truth about my work on veterans issues. I'm proud of my record, and I know my father would be proud of my record too.
Can I ask, why is this the way of campaigning these days? Where it's all about who you aren't or who somebody is or what, it has nothing to do with issues. For us on the western end of the state, we don't know what the issues are among the candidates. We just know who didn't do this or who did do that. Why is that?
Well, I think it's because of the enormously outsized role that secret donors have in politics these days. There's no accountability. They've already spent over $15 million against me in this race, and they aren't accountable to the voters of Iowa because people don't know who they are. They are not required to disclose who's paying for these ads. Senator Ernst and I are both required by law to list who our donors are. It'll be reported on October 15th who that most recent list is. And so I can't control what outside groups are doing or saying about me. What I can control is reaching out to the voters of Iowa and talk to them about the issues I care about. And I've been doing that. I've been traveling around the state talking about the need to raise the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour and give 300,000 Iowans a pay raise. I've been traveling around the state doing retirement security roundtables. I did them in the Sioux lands. Had people come in and talk about their concerns about protecting and preserving Social Security and Medicare and my plans for doing that. I've been doing education roundtables. I did them at 9 colleges and universities around the state. I talked about what I've done in Congress to expand Pell Grants, cut student interest rates in half, protect tax credits and tax deductions for college affordability, and my plan to give students with high student loan debt the ability to refinance if they get an opportunity to do that. I've also contrasted that with my opponent who wants to get rid of the Department of Education, and that would threaten Pell Grants to 110,000 Iowa students. She wants to get the federal government out of the student loan business. That would jeopardize federal student loans to over 220,000 Iowa students. They would see their interest rates skyrocket in the private marketplace. We had one young woman at Drake University who's paying 18% on private student loans. The average college student going from 4.4 to 12 or 18% is going to be paying $20,000, $30,000 more in interest payments alone. So look, I've been traveling around the state. On Labor Day, I went from Clinton to Council Bluffs to Sioux City in less than 24 hours. I'm spending time talking to Iowans because they deserve to talk about issues that they care about.
I just want to go back to that, I guess it's September 20th, the hearing in 2012 and the VA. Now, to understand, you showed the photo of outside the oversight government relations.
No, this is outside the VA hearing room.
Okay, well anyway, that you were present for that the other committee meeting, but I think several media outlets checked, and there wasn't any video of you on C-SPAN or that was ever to show that you were actually at the hearing. And isn't it true that you actually did attend the 3 fundraisers, so that would be an accurate claim that same day?
It's absolutely true that at the end of the quarter, people go to fundraising events when they're in Washington, D.C. In fact, Senator Ernst left the debate and flew to Washington to attend fundraisers yesterday. So that's one of the things that happens. But at no time was I at a fundraiser when that VA hearing was going on. So to suggest falsely in the ad that I missed that hearing because I was at a fundraiser is not true.
I understand. Well, I understand that, but what about the hearing that coincided roughly in time with the VA one?
There was.
Were you actually at that?
I was. I checked in at the oversight hearing. It was on Fast and Furious. What happens at those hearings is there is a long waiting list in order to get to ask questions. So when you go to the hearing, the committee chairs make 5-minute speeches. Then the witnesses come. They are allowed to make 5-minute speeches. Then questions begin, and you have to wait your turn in order to be able to ask a question. And depending upon your seniority, you may wait a long time. During that period of time, you could have meetings scheduled with constituents in your office, or in this case, I ended up going to the World War II Memorial to greet veterans, including some from my district, who were down there for an honor flight. That's a very important priority for me, because when they make the effort to come out and visit those memorials, and I'm in Washington, D.C., I feel it's an important responsibility to show up and thank them for their service.
Okay.
I've got some issue follow-ups based on when you were talking about traveling the state and what you've been talking about. But I have one other, I guess you'd say it's a political question I want to ask first, and that's, you've said your opponent has a radical agenda. Mm-hmm. Some people might think President Obama has a radical agenda, and you far more often than not support him with your votes and your words and your actions. Why is she a radical and he is not?
Well, I'll tell you what I think is radical about her agenda, and then you can tell me what you're referring to when you're talking about the president's radical agenda, and I'll be happy to respond to it.
You know as well as I do. I mean, there are critics who think his environmental positions are radical. They believe his spending is radical. They believe his executive powers that he takes on his own with respect to immigration and other issues is radical. I mean, that isn't news I'm breaking here. I mean, some people on the right perceive him as a radical president. He's called a socialist by some.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you support his agenda and think his agenda is not radical, but hers is?
Well, first let me say I support Iowa's agenda. There have been clear issues where I have strongly disagreed with the president and strongly challenged him. His administration's efforts to try to reduce the renewable fuel standards volume targets is one of the clearest examples of that.
Yes.
I have been taking him on because my support for the RFS from the beginning has been clear, strong, and unequivocal. I voted to triple the volume. One of the first things I did as a new member of Congress that set the targets at the levels they're at right now. And I have talked to the president personally, I've talked to the vice president, I've talked to the EPA administrator, and I have pointed out to them what a wrong decision it is to move forward on this proposed rule and that we shouldn't do anything about it. And I've taken strong positions against the president on many other issues. But I want to make sure I clarify what I'm talking about when I'm referring to her extreme agenda. Mm-hmm. Repealing the federal minimum wage is an extreme Tea Party idea. And calling it reckless, to me, is an insult to all these Iowans who would get a pay raise, 300,000 of them. They haven't had any, they've lost 30% of their purchasing power on a minimum wage salary since the last time it was increased. 60% of those Iowans who would get a pay raise are women. 50% of them are over the age of 30. So this isn't just entry-level jobs that we're talking about here. So that's one. Wanting to privatize Social Security is an issue that I think is an extreme agenda. I don't think that's an effective retirement plan for Iowa. I think it's just another retirement plan for Wall Street investment bankers. And we saw what happened during the recession and the trillions of dollars that were lost in a short period of time. That's not what Social Security was set up for. Wanting to repeal the Department of Education and jeopardize Pell Grants and student loans and increase dramatically the cost of higher education. I think that's an extreme position. Voting to shut down the federal government, which what she said she would have done with Ted Cruz. When we saw what happened, it cost the economy billions of dollars. It threatened payments to men and women in uniform, veterans, seniors, and children, and people with disabilities. That's an extreme agenda to me. Calling the president a dictator and saying impeachment should be on the table. That is an extreme agenda to me. Those are some of the examples of what I mean when I refer to her extreme Tea Party agenda that is wrong for Iowa.
Here's a vote in support of the president you cast, and that was on the Affordable Care Act. Mm-hmm. You regretted all that vote, and do you think the Affordable Care Act is working?
I think the Affordable Care Act has had a significant positive impact on the state of Iowa. 80,000 Iowans who didn't used to have health insurance now have it. There are certainly things that need to be fixed about the Affordable Care Act. My position is we need to fix what's wrong and improve it. Senator Ernst's position is to repeal it and continue to obstruct efforts to provide health care. And we can't go back to the days when you could throw kids off their parents' policies because of pre-existing conditions, when women could be discriminated against in terms of health care insurance pricing, and when insurance companies could cancel your policies without notice or without limitation. I had a number of round town hall meetings on the Affordable Care Act, and I took a picture of my nephew to each one. He was diagnosed with liver cancer before he was 2 years old. They saved his life in Des Moines at Blank Children's Hospital by cutting out 2/3 of his liver. He had enormous uninsured health care costs, and we did fundraisers for him and his family at a time when, before the Affordable Care Act, medical bankruptcies were the biggest number of bankruptcies in this country. And now, parents like his don't have to worry about annual caps on benefits, lifetime caps on benefits, having their kids thrown off of policies for pre-existing conditions. Seniors in Iowa are getting on average $800 back on prescription drug costs that they didn't before the Affordable Care Act because we're closing the donut hole. And I worked with Governor Branstad to get a waiver for expansion of health care in Iowa so that 80,000 Iowans now have access to health care because of what Governor Branstad and the Iowa legislature did that I helped them to make happen.
What do you think needs to be fixed within the Affordable Care Act? You said
Well,
we need to go in and fix what isn't working. What isn't working?
I voted to let individuals continue non-conforming policies. We voted to make sure that small businesses didn't have some of the burdensome paperwork that was going to impose undue burdens on their responsibility under the Affordable Care Act. And we need to continue to look at areas that aren't working as efficiently as they should and continue to identify areas where there may be unanticipated waste, fraud, or abuse going on. What's encouraging is that we've recovered $20 billion related to healthcare fraud in the last couple of years, and that's a significant increase over what we've done in the past. We know that there are parts of the country, including South Florida in particular, where this fraud is costing taxpayers billions of dollars, and we need to keep cracking down on it because that takes money out of the hands of people who depend upon it. But I worked with the Iowa hospitals and the Iowa physicians to address a long-standing problem in the Affordable Care Act of inequitable reimbursement to healthcare providers in Iowa. They have historically been in the top in quality patient outcome rankings and in the bottom in per-patient Medicare reimbursement. I took on Democrats during those negotiations as part of a quality care coalition. That resulted in changing the way that we pay for healthcare to reward quality outcomes, not just on a fee-for-services basis. And it also resulted in Iowa healthcare providers getting significant reimbursements to make up for some of that inequity as we're making that transition to this new system.
The minimum wage.
Mm-hmm.
You support raising the federal minimum wage to $10.10 per hour. Any concerns about what impact that will have on businesses and on jobs in a negative sense?
Of course, you always have concerns. You want to make sure that people are continuing to hire employees and that they're continuing to create opportunities. But you have to always look at the impact, because when you look at the fact that 300,000 Iowans would get a pay raise simply by raising the minimum wage to $10.10 an hour, it shows you the level of need in many parts of the state where adults are working full-time and getting paid $15,000 a year and are effectively living in poverty and eligible for federal programs because the wage they're earning isn't enough to take care of them and their families. And if you look historically at past periods where we have raised the minimum wage and restored its purchasing power, we haven't seen the dire predictions come true of vast numbers of jobs disappearing. What we've seen, and this is supported by Nobel Prize winning economists, is that it has a ripple effect because it pumps more money into the economy. And one of the side benefits for raising the minimum wage is that it would put about $6 billion of new contributions into the Social Security and Medicare Trust Fund every year. Because people earning minimum wage right now, every pay increase they get, they're going to be paying fully into both of the trust funds for Social Security and Medicare based on that level of income. So it also has a positive impact on stabilizing those trust funds, which is a good thing for Iowa seniors.
You talk about the ripple effect in the economy. Wouldn't it also potentially, and I have seen in the past, that it would perhaps erode the buying power of those very same people through businesses forced to absorb those added costs of employing people, that a lot of those companies are not gonna just eat that, they're gonna pass it on to higher costs for whether it's at the retail level or other, other services and so forth. And if it raises inflation to some degree, does that negate some of the benefits without actually doing a lot for those, enough for those people? That I mean, there's a lot of unknowns of what could happen when you do that.
Well, there's certainly a lot of unknowns, and there are a lot of variables, and you can't assume that everything is going to be the same in every geographic location. But the reason these Nobel Prize winning economists reached the conclusions they did is they've weighed those factors and have concluded that the positive ripple effects outweigh the factors you're talking about in providing added economic benefits to the economy and to the people who are in most need of getting that type of a boost in their income. I mean, one of the reasons Henry Ford paid his factory workers a living wage is because he realized that then they would be in a position to buy his automobiles, and that would be a good thing for him and his shareholders.
Why did you vote for cap and trade? And what other measures related to climate change do you support? And is there a fear of going too far with respect to climate change in terms of hurting businesses, domestic American businesses, with too much legislation? And then just talk a little about your personal philosophy on the subject of global warming and climate change, if you would, please.
I wished I'd brought in my bag with me, and I would have showed you the Climate Action Partnership Blueprint for Change, which formed the basis of the legislation that we passed on the American Clean Energy and Security Act. And if you open up that Climate Action Partnership, you saw all the U.S. corporations who supported that effort and stood behind the Blueprint for Change. It included companies like John Deere, included companies like Alcoa, Pepsi, included many of the big energy companies, and many of the environmental groups. And it includes an unequivocal statement that climate change is real, and it's bad for the U.S. economy, and we need to do something about it. And then it had proposals on what we could do. And their number one proposal was to implement a cap and trade system to try to make the economy be more responsive to some of the changes that we have to adapt to because of our changing climate. And if you haven't read it, I strongly encourage you to read it. It's available online. It's called the Climate Action Partnership's Blueprint for Change. And one of the things that we tried to do was look at the economic opportunities for agriculture to be in the vanguard of creating economic opportunities in responding to climate change. So one of the things we were looking at was something called carbon sequestration, which is how you take carbon that's in the atmosphere and remove it and do it in a way that could be economically beneficial. And states like Iowa were one of the states that had the most opportunity because of what we have already going on in the state, being in the vanguard of innovation with biofuels. You know, right down in Shenandoah, in the middle of a cornfield, is one of the most advanced algae research facilities in the world, and they're taking commercially pure carbon dioxide off of an ethanol plant and using it to develop all these amazing things with algae. Well, carbon sequestration in the hands of Iowa's entrepreneurs and innovators, we could have come up with economic opportunities that could have been beneficial to Iowa through that. Those are some of the reasons why I supported the legislation. And look, we had people at the table in the Energy and Commerce hearing, people representing coal, people representing oil, people from all across the country who had input into that final bill. And that's the reason why I supported it.
Where do we stand in Washington on the RFS? What's your take on where that's going to end up, and do you think there's going to be any change in the RFS?
Well, let's start with where it stands. Okay. First of all, it came out as a proposed rule from EPA. And as you could imagine, there was a swift and strong backlash. I was very involved in that. I worked with an organization called Vote Vets to deliver 100,000 signatures to the EPA administrator protesting the decision to reduce the RFS, and Vote Vets was a critical piece of that because their message is we need this homegrown energy source so we are less dependent on foreign oil, and when you send us into harm's way, many times it's because we're trying to protect our oil supply. I also solicited comments from constituents and delivered over 400 of them, spoke personally to the EPA administrator, have spoken to the president, the vice president, their chiefs of staff strongly opposing this and talking about why we had strong bipartisan support when we passed these greater volumes in 2007. After all that happened, it got referred to the Office of Management and Budget, which is reviewing the economic impacts of the proposed rule change and again taking comments, and we've been putting pressure on OMB. And so right now, it sounds like a decision could come down sometime this fall. I have continued to apply pressure from the White House on down not to make changes because it doesn't make any sense, especially given the capacity that we're seeing out here this year, the ability to continue to reduce our dependency with these homegrown biofuels, but it's in the hands of the administration, and we'll see what they do.
Do you have a sense in talking to people within the administration on how that's going to go?
I don't have a clear sense on what the ultimate outcome is going to be, in part because people are continuing to weigh in against this. But look, it's no secret who we're up against. It's big oil.
Absolutely.
And I have been very clear that there is a war on renewable energy being funded by big oil. And they are also one of the biggest funders of my opponent's campaign. The Koch brothers, the American Petroleum Institute, ExxonMobil hosted a big fundraiser for her, and that is one of the clearest choices for Iowans in this race. I have never equivocated on renewable fuels. My opponent has said that the renewable fuel standards is something she doesn't agree with in principle, and in a perfect world it wouldn't exist. I have never said that. I have always been a strong proponent. I think this industry is absolutely critical to Iowa's future, and that's why I've spent a lot of my time visiting ethanol and biodiesel, and I'm stopping later today at Project Liberty in Emmitsburg to tour it, because to me, the most important thing for Iowa's next senator on energy is to keep fighting for renewable energy that's creating jobs in Iowa, not to fight for the agenda of big oil.
Did you have a follow-up, Dave?
No.
Okay. Energy still. Why did you change your mind about the Keystone XL pipeline? What's your current position on the Keystone XL pipeline? And even though I know Congress wouldn't be involved in this issue, do you have any thoughts on whether that proposed pipeline, oil pipeline in Iowa, which would ship crude from North Dakota to Illinois, would be good or would be bad for the state?
Let me start with Keystone. The reason I voted against Keystone and the reason I'm opposed to Keystone when it came to the House floor is because a lot of promises that had been made about Keystone at the beginning, by the time that vote came to the House floor, didn't seem to be holding water anymore. One of the promises was that it was going to dramatically increase the supply of oil to the United States. The more we learned about what was happening with that oil and where it was headed, that it was going to a trade-free zone in Texas, which would allow it to be exported overseas without a lot of incentive to keep it here in the United States and increase domestic oil supplies, was a big concern to me. The other promise that was made, it was going to create a lot of jobs that were going to create opportunities for Iowans. And the more that I studied it, the more it seemed like the jobs that were going to be created were going to be temporary. There was no guarantee that a lot of Iowans were going to be able to find work, and that was going to be long-term jobs for them. So when I look at energy policies as Iowa's next senator, I'm going to be looking at three things. What does it do to reduce our dependence on foreign oil? What does it do to create economic opportunities and jobs in Iowa? And what does it do to promote Iowa's existing renewable energy economy? an economy that employs 75,000 people. The Iowa Renewable Fuels Association has also expressed these concerns because right now, big oil still has a lot of favorable incentives, even on pipeline construction, that don't exist to biofuels producers. And I had worked with Lee Terry in Nebraska to try to introduce legislation in the Energy and Commerce Committee to construct a biofuels pipeline, because getting homegrown biofuels to areas where the demand is greatest is a challenge. We're seeing that right now because of a lot of it is shipped by rail. But if you're an ethanol or a biodiesel producer, you don't have the same type of opportunities that big oil companies do in constructing pipelines to deliver your product to where it needs to go. On the Iowa pipeline, I still don't have enough information to have a final opinion. You're absolutely right, it's going to be a state-based decision. But the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association, which has supported what I do in Congress, has expressed some concerns because of the unbalanced playing field that I just talked about.
Immigration.
Yeah.
Difficult challenge. What's your philosophical approach to that issue? The border part of it, the illegals already in this country part of it, and what potentially could happen to exacerbate that problem moving forward.
To me, this is another example where obstruction in Washington is keeping us from moving forward on solutions to these very important problems. The Senate passed an overwhelming bipartisan immigration reform bill over a year ago with 68 votes that I believe would pass on the floor of the House right now if it was brought to a vote by the Speaker. It included enormous investments in beefing up border security. And it also provided a pathway to citizenship for people in this country illegally by making sure that they admit they broke the law, they pay a steep fine, they go to the back of the line, and they earn their way into citizenship. Now, this came up during our debate, and my opponent brought up the word that people always bring up to try to keep meaningful immigration reform from happening: amnesty. I don't support amnesty. Amnesty is when you break the law and there are no consequences for your behavior. That's not what I'm talking about. That's certainly not what Senator McCain voted for and Senator Rubio voted for in the Senate bill. Because when you require someone to admit they broke the law and they have to pay a steep price, be on probation, pay a fine, go to the back of the line, you're forcing them to do something to acknowledge that what they did was wrong. But you look at what's happening in Iowa. I talked to dairy farmers who used to have the hired man who'd get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and milk cows late at night. Fewer and fewer of those people live out in rural areas, and a lot of dairy farmers are hiring immigrant laborers to help them. Seed corn companies. Senator Ernst and I both detasseled corn when we were younger. Right now, when I talk to Iowa seed corn companies, they're hiring between 30 and 40% of the people to detassel seed corn who are immigrants. I talk to our high-tech employers here in the Sioux lands, down in central Iowa, in eastern Iowa where I live. We're educating great young people who didn't come from this country at our great research universities, and then they're leaving to go back home or go to other great places around the world to find jobs because we can't get them jobs here in the United States because we can't solve this problem. That's why doing nothing to me is not a solution to these problems.
And a follow-up to that would be sort of revisiting my first question, the low approval rating of Congress. I don't know what your sense is, but my sense is the reason that number is low is because there's a feeling among Americans that not much gets done. And not much gets done probably because of polarization, partisanship, and so forth. How do we get to that point, and how do we move from that point? Because if it doesn't change, it continues to move forward, nothing happens, the approval rating stays low, it's a vicious cycle. How do we get to the point where it seems among Americans as if Congress can't agree on what day of the week it is and can't get anything done? How does that culture change, if you will? Well,
first of all, I'm incredibly frustrated that Congress can't get anything done. I get their frustration. But a lot of your readers probably saw the movie Lincoln. If you watched Lincoln, you would realize this is not a new problem of Congress not being able to get along. You go back to the very first presidential election between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. It was bitter.
Very nasty.
Very nasty. Horrible things were said. And back then, most newspapers were political organs, affiliated with one or another of a political party. And they were part of the effort to try to educate voters about the individual candidates, and they did it in a highly partisan way. But now we live in a news cycle that changes on a nanosecond. And people are constantly bombarded with information, whether it's on 24-hour news, on their TVs, social media constantly bombarding people. And a lot of the people who participate kind of hide behind a level of anonymity because we don't know who they are. We just know that they have a lot to say. I think that the Citizens United decision, which allowed unlimited campaign spending by secret donors without transparency and without accountability, has been one of the other worst things that's happened, because it's made it much more difficult to create the type of environment where people can come together, work to solve these tough problems in a bipartisan way. And it's a reality of what's going on in campaigns today.
Do you think more gets done in Washington behind the scenes between members than most Americans might appreciate or understand?
Absolutely. Because
everyone we meet with says, I work with this person across the aisle and I work with that person across the aisle, whether it's Democrat or Republican, but yet that sort of feeling among Americans seems to linger, that nobody talks to each other and nobody works with one another.
No, I mean, it's unfortunate that that's all people see. They don't see what goes on behind the scenes. They don't see Democrats and Republicans together in a classified briefing on ISIS. Both sides enormously concerned about a terrorist threat and what it means to the security of our country and our people. Maybe not agreeing on every specific solution, but they're asking important questions and trying to find out what more can be done to help improve the situation and protect Americans at home and abroad. And they don't see members walking out of those briefings and coming up and visiting with each other and talking in friendship and a purpose of wanting to do something together. They probably weren't watching when the president of Ukraine addressed us as a joint session of Congress, and Democrats and Republicans rose in unison to applaud the spirit of independence and liberty and the need to support countries who are trying to promote it around the globe. And they don't see the things that happen, like when I moved into my office that I'm in right now, and the first thing I see is a Nebraska Cornhusker flag hanging over my doorway, because Lee Terry's office was right across the hall from me.
Well, you took that down immediately.
I took it down immediately, and then I tried to figure out what I was going to do to pay Lee back. But oftentimes I'll see his constituents standing outside his door waiting to go in, and I'll stop and visit with them. And it's not uncommon to come out of the Capitol and see one of your friends, a Republican, standing down there visiting with their constituents, and to go up and to talk to them and say, you know, that they're lucky to have someone like that representing them. That's the type of thing that you rarely see in a news story, but it happens all the time.
Now, Jeff, you keep me on time here, okay? I have a tendency to just go until somebody gives me a shove.
Do you mind if I ask it?
I'm trying to figure out how many.
It's a very simple question, but how do you convince people in Northwest Iowa that you're going to represent them?
It's very simple. To me, Iowa is Iowa. Before I ran for Congress, I worked all over the state of Iowa. I had an opportunity to meet great people up in Woodbury County and Plymouth County. And one of the things that draws us together is our common identity as Iowans. And I think it's unfortunate sometimes people try to label us based upon the geography and what part of the state we come from. Last season, my high school football team made it to the state championship game, and they lost to West Lyon, which had a phenomenal football team last year. And as I was making my 99 county tour of Iowa, I stopped in Lyon County, and they were completely jacked up about the football team. You know, I made a comment because that was before the championship game had been determined, you know, about how excited I was about how my team was doing. I knew that West Lyon was doing really well. They made it very clear to me they were going to win the championship. But as a kid who grew up in a small town and went to a consolidated school district, I knew almost every consolidated school district in the state. And every year during the state basketball tournament, you know, those maps would have lights showing who was left. And it was a constant progression that talked about what brings us together as Iowans. You know, my great-grandfather, whose name, I'm not kidding, was George Washington Braley, walked here from Vermont in 1848 when he was 15 years old, looking for better farm ground. My family's been farming here in Iowa ever since. I've lived here my whole life. It's been an incredible place for me and my family. I love the fact that Iowans come together in times of need, the way they did in my hometown. I have an aunt who lives in Percival, Iowa. When the horrific flooding hit this area in 2011 and devastated communities all along the Missouri, my aunt called me because she was frustrated. She didn't think enough was being done about this. And I picked up my mom, we drove 500 miles down to Percival, and I was flabbergasted at the level of devastation to this town I'd visited as a kid. And I met with people from Fremont County. It wasn't my congressional district, but I'd had enormous experience with this in 2008. Had the largest tornado in the United States devastate my district in Parkersburg and other communities. 10 days later, worst flooding in our state's history. One of the reasons I missed votes is I left when I saw the railroad bridge in Waterloo fall into the river on CNN. I called up my staff. I said, you need to get me home. I missed a week's worth of votes, went home and was sandbagging for 2 nights, wading through waist-deep water to get to neighborhoods that needed help. That's what Iowans do. That's why my aunt wanted me to come to her community so that I could help convince other members how serious this problem was in western Iowa. And you know, that's a lesson I learned a long time ago. You can listen to people, you can read things about what's going on. The best way to inform yourself is to go to the area where the problem is unfolding, talk to people who are experiencing it, listen, learn, see, and it makes you a much better advocate in trying to convince people that help is needed.
This is going to be an incredibly awkward transition, but I'm trying to prioritize my questions in the time I have left. You mentioned ISIS in a previous answer. I want to ask a foreign policy question, and that's the hottest one. You might, if you're elected, cast some votes with respect to Syria and Iraq and ISIS. What's your overall position on what you would vote for and what you would vote against, including use of ground troops?
Well, we just voted to give limited authority to strike ISIS in Syria and Iraq. And there were bipartisan concerns about the nature of that limited authority. Because nobody, I think, wants another decade of nation building in Iraq. We saw some of the results of that when our hard-earned investment of almost $30 billion to train and equip 950,000 members of the Iraqi army, police force, and border patrol resulted in a terrorist group of 15,000 pretty much rolling them up in western and northern Iraq. So, no nation building, no boots on the ground. We need to work with our allies in the region, and we're making significant progress with 5 Arab states involved in the air campaign and more Arab states involved in training fighters who can coordinate with that air campaign and take the war to this terrorist group. But the simple truth is that ISIS is a terrorist group that's a threat to America. It needs to be eliminated. The people responsible for killing American citizens need to be brought to justice or to the grave. And we need to work with our allies around the globe to make that happen.
Last one?
Well, I just do a follow-up,
All right,
but
then I've
Yeah.
got a
you
follow-up.
mentioned voting for the authority. I think in the debate on Sunday night, and I think some of the Republicans have called attention to this, that you said there was authorization for airstrikes.
No, I did not say that during the
Okay, so as I understand, the vote was to authorize to arm the fighters in
Right.
Syria.
So I can explain to you
Okay.
the misinformation that people are providing.
Okay.
I did not say during the debate airstrikes.
Okay.
I said strikes. That's what training troops on the ground to do, to coordinate with the airstrikes, is training people to engage in strikes against ISIS. I did not use the word airstrikes.
Okay.
As kind of a wind-up on my part, I wanted to ask a sort of a general question, and
Sure.
if you could cite 2 or 3 examples of votes you've cast or pieces of legislation that you have authored or co-authored that you are most proud of, that most speak to who you are as a person and as a member of Congress, what might those be?
The one I mentioned earlier is the Andrew Connolly Veterans Housing Act. And the reason I'm so proud of that is it started off as a simple constituent service request. A brave young man with a young family and a profoundly disabled son who couldn't stay in his home because he was becoming paralyzed from the chest down and simply wanted assistance through the VA so he could do that. He got turned down, reached out to me, and my great staff got him those benefits in a very short period of time. Went to his home to meet him and his family. He was so grateful. And then later, this wonderful community of Dubuque turned your tax dollars in the form of that VA grant into a brand new home for this family that allowed them to have some dignity and an ability to have an independent life before he died. He then came out and testified in front of the Veterans Affairs Committee, and it was so powerful that it allowed people to see that this was an important need, that we needed to extend these benefits and improve them. And even though I wasn't serving in the majority, because of my working relationships with the Republican chair of Veterans Affairs, that important legislation was included in a package of veterans bills that went to the floor, got passed, and became law. And now the Andrew Connolly Veterans Housing Act is continuing to help disabled veterans stay in their homes even after he died. His whole point from the date of his diagnosis until he died was that we need to pay it forward and take care of people who need our help. I think Andrew would be proud that that's happening, and that's why I'm so proud to have played a small part in helping those veterans.
How would Iowa be better served with you as a senator taking Tom Markin's place than Joni Ernst?
I think because I'm a bridge builder, not a bridge burner. I have a proven history of working with Republicans in the House and the Senate to try to solve tough problems that benefit the people of Iowa. I'm easy to work with. I take pride in the fact that I have a lot of friends who are Republicans who care about me. And even though we don't vote together on the floor the same way every day, we have an ability to find common ground on issues we care about, the same way that Lee Terry and I have worked together to try to protect and defend the renewable fuel standard.
What's your relationship with Chuck Grassley like right now?
It's great. I know that surprises people. Chuck Grassley called me the morning after I won my first race to congratulate me, to remind me that I was now his congressman, which I had completely not thought about, and very kindly invited me to have breakfast with him in the Senate dining room when I came to Washington. And we did, and we had a great meeting. We've worked well together in the past, and I value that relationship. And I mentioned during the debate, it was one of those lightning round questions. If you're elected, who's the first person you call? I said without hesitation, Chuck Grassley. I was been blessed to have this 30-year period where they've had a Democratic senator and a Republican senator who had very different visions of what we should do to solve problems, but found a way to work together and find common ground when it was good for Iowa. I would look forward to continuing that tradition, and I think it's helpful to Iowa because depending upon what's happening at a given year in the political makeup of Congress, having a senator who's a Democrat, having a senator who's a Republican can be very valuable to Iowa.